Welcome everyone to the February 2022 edition of Voices for the West, a webinar series brought to you by Advocates for the West. The title of tonight's webinar is Protecting Public Lands and Wildlife at Point Reyes National Seashore. My name is Will Shoemaker and I am Director of Communications and Engagement for Advocates for the West. We're so very grateful to be joined tonight by Laura Cunningham, Jeff Miller, and Chance Cutrano. Advocates for the West staff attorney Lizzy Potter will be facilitating the conversation and formally introducing our panelists here shortly. If you are tuning in to watch this evening's webinar, you will remain on mute throughout the presentations. However, we do welcome your questions. At the bottom of your screen, you should see a Q&A section. And this is different from the chat section, I will point out. So please, if you do have any questions, place them in the Q&A section during the course of the presentations. You can do so at any point that the presentations are taking place. You don't have to wait until the very end of the talks. We will discuss as many of those questions as time allows in about the last 10 to 15 minutes. Tonight's webinar is being recorded and will soon be up on our YouTube channel. We are planning another Voices for the West webinar on March 30th with special guests from Grand Salmon, the Source to Sea project. As part of this project, a group of 3 women will ski and paddle more than 1,000 miles this year along the natural migration path of salmon from their hatching grounds in central Idaho all the way to the Pacific Ocean. This project is in an effort to promote removal of the lower Snake River dams to save rapidly dwindling salmon populations from extinction, and also to promote protection of the headwaters region from a proposal to reopen and expand the stibnite mine in Idaho. I am going to be turning off my camera here in a second and putting myself on mute. So without further ado, I will turn the floor over to Lizzy.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Will. As Will mentioned, my name is Lizzy Potter. I'm a staff attorney with Advocates for the West. I'm based in Bend, Oregon. And I know we have many people here tonight who might be new to Advocates for the West. So I just want to explain a little bit about who we are. We are a nonprofit law firm. We provide pro bono legal services to conservation groups like the groups that are represented by these folks today, tribes and other activists. We're primarily focused in federal court litigation, and our work stretches throughout the American West. It's pretty incredible. We work from the coast of California to the Rocky Mountains, northern Washington borderlands down to southern borderlands in Arizona. So we really cover a lot of ground. But today I'm thrilled to be here to talk about one of my favorite cases, the Point Reyes National Seashore work that I've been working on since I arrived at Advocates almost 7 years ago. So what's really unique about Point Reyes is that it is one of the only national parks that has beef and dairy ranching on public lands. Makes it very unique. It's down in Marin County, California. And for those of you who have been following this saga for a long time, you might recall that we brought a lawsuit in 2016 that resulted in the first ever environmental impact statement and general management plan that ever addressed whether ranching should continue on these lands, which had been purchased for millions and millions of dollars by the taxpayers from these private ranchers. And so this ranching continues today on public lands. And so we recently filed a lawsuit challenging this management plan. And so just a couple pertinent details about that plan for those of you who aren't familiar with it tonight. The Park Service under the Trump administration crafted this plan, and it decided to double down on ranching, not just continue it as it had been in the past, it's traditional beef and dairy ranching, but the plan expands the footprint of these ranches that are allowed under the general management plan. It also allows ranchers to expand their operations by allowing new livestock, different types of commercial crops, Airbnb-like options, processing facilities potentially like mobile slaughterhouses, if you can believe it, and a whole host of other commercial activities. Some of those are not allowed immediately, but there's a roadmap under this general management plan that will allow them to be considered in the future. The plan also quadruples the length of existing leases from 5 years to up to 20 years, giving these ranchers a lot of potential economic and commercial benefits. But one of the most controversial parts of this plan that we're going to be talking about tonight is the Park Service's allowance for itself to kill a dozen or so elk, Tule elk, each year, not for natural resource purposes, but to help protect these ranchers. Another controversial part of the plan is a succession policy that allows the current ranchers, gives those current ranchers, many of whom are descendants of the ranchers who were paid millions of dollars in money to fork over this land to the public. Many of those ranchers have preference for new leases that can continue, potentially in perpetuity. And so that succession policy is another controversial part of this plan. But we're not here to actually talk about the lawsuit tonight. We're here to talk about some of the whys. Why is this beef and dairy ranching on public lands such a problem? Why has public sentiment changed so drastically since 2016? When we first got involved in this lawsuit, these folks and some others were standing up strong for, the environment and the public interest here. But there was a lot of controversy over this. And so over the last several years, things have really changed. And I'll just put a plug in for the National Environmental Policy Act. And when the government finally started studying these issues and disclosing some of their impacts and asking the public what they thought, lo and behold, it was not as rosy as some originally thought. And there was a lot of community organizing that these folks and others did. And so we're going to learn a little bit today about, what are some of those impacts that really pushed people to support this cause. And, also, why did millions of people wind up calling on the Biden administration to reject this Trump administration prepared plan and chart a new future for Point Reyes? But we're going to conclude with our client's vision of what a future at Point Reyes would look like without private commercial ranching and with, a public restoration option that was studied under the plan. So that's some of what we're going to be covered today. And so first, I'd like to introduce Jeff Miller. Jeff is going to kick us off talking about some Tule elk. Jeff is a senior conservation associate at the Center for Biological Diversity. He's focused on protecting endangered species and biodiversity in California. He grew up in the Bay Area and started visiting Point Reyes National Seashore back in the 1960s. So we're grateful to have Jeff here, and he's going to kick it off talking about some Tule elk. So for now, Jeff, turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, Lizzy. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
All right, great. All right, good evening, everyone. I'm going to take you through a quick history of Point Reyes Tule elk, from reintroduction and confinement to expansion and persecution. And I'm going to touch a little on mismanagement and some blown opportunities at Point Reyes and statewide for elk conservation. So, a good place to start is by examining the mission of the National Park Service, which is to preserve unimpaired the natural and cultural resources and values of the national park system for the enjoyment, education, and inspiration of this and future generations. So how did we get from this laudable vision to efforts to haze, harass, sterilize, fence, remove, or slaughter native Tule elk in the only national park where they occur? And how did the Park Service choose alternative B for their park management plan? This is the alternative that prioritizes commercial livestock operations and hazing, fencing, shooting elk over what they admit is the environmentally superior alternative. That's F, which would end cattle grazing and let the elk roam free and actually be elk. Next slide. So some of the landmarks in the Tule elk reintroduction at Point Reyes, and you'll quickly come to see that ranchers have dictated the terms from the beginning. So for more than 500,000 Tule elk in California historically, pretty quickly after European arrival, the species was almost driven extinct. It was down to just one small herd with a handful of elk by 1870. And the formerly large elk herds at Point Reyes were wiped out by hunting, cattle ranching, and agriculture. With the creation of the national park in the early 1960s, the private ranches were purchased over the next decade or so. And important to remember that the ranchers took public money for their land and signed limited 25 to 30-year grazing leases that expired long ago. So in 1978, the Park Service reintroduced tule elk to the park, and they put them on Tamales Point in the northern part of the park. They trapped them in a 2,600-acre fenced elk reserve because of the objections of the ranchers. So these elk were penned on a peninsula that has few natural water sources and has inadequate forage and minerals, and these elk are unable to roam. In 1998, the Park Service did a Point Reyes Elk Management Plan, and the focus of that was to expand elk into wilderness areas of the park to allow for free roaming herd. But this plan also contained appeasements to the ranchers, allowed capture and relocation of quote, wayward elk, contraception of elk in the event of the Tamales herd surpassing 250 to 350 animals, and even killing aggressive elk that had conflicts with cattle ranches. But starting in 1998, they transplanted 27 elk to wilderness areas south of Limantour. Some elk split off and quickly established a new herd near Drake's Beach. And it's important to remember, shortly after that, there began an extensive Park Service effort to remove, actually it had begun a lot earlier, but an effort to remove invasive fallow and axis deer. They shot more than 4,000 of these non-native deer from 1976 to 2009. And these non-native ungulates caused extensive habitat damage. They competed with the native ungulates, the elk and the native deer, and spread diseases. And one of the reasons for their removal was to protect tule elk. But this was a huge local controversy, especially from 2007 to 2009, when they finished shooting and sterilizing most of the remaining deer. And this is, among other things, this effort angered Senator Dianne Feinstein. So also during this period, the Park Service took a number of actions to restore some impaired ecosystems in the park, consistent with their mission. So they started extensive restoration of salmon and steelhead habitat, fencing cattle out from streams and riparian areas in Point Reyes and the GGNRA. They did culvert removals for fish passage. In 2008, they finished up the Jackamini wetlands restoration, which was removal of a former ranch and levees, a huge wetlands restoration. And starting in 2000, the Park Service repeatedly announced that it was going to update its antiquated management plan, which was from 1980. They actually held scoping, they took public comments, and they even released a draft that included alternatives to end or reduce ranching. And the ranchers, of course, went ballistic. By 2010, the Park Service had mysteriously abandoned the planning process without any explanation. And Feinstein and the ranchers were definitely involved in, we suspect, in scuttling that. So then came the Drake's Estero, the Wilderness Oyster Wars from 2011 to 2015. In 2012, the Secretary of the Interior let a private oyster farm lease expire in the park and declined to issue a new permit. This is a massive conservation win. Drake's Estero is a hugely important ecological area. It reverted to wilderness status, but it was controversial, and it took a coordinated public campaign to make that happen. Feinstein again opposed the Park Service, supported the oyster farm. The controversy drew in kind of Bundy adjacent public lands privatization movement folks. And the upshot of this was that a backroom deal was made, a promise to give ranchers long-term leases in exchange for removing the oyster farm. And Feinstein and Jared Huffman came away believing that the Park Service would give ranchers everything they wanted. Of course, this isn't legal. The Park Service can't just hand out private leases like it's candy. There's supposed to be a planning process under the Point Reyes Act and the Organic Act. So even after this decision and the oyster farm was lease ended, the owner continued to lobby and harass the Park Service, had ties to the Trump movement, and a lot of the Bundy anti-public lands movement folks were involved. So then in 2014 to 2015, the Park Service tried to quietly push through what they called a ranch comprehensive management plan. And this was essentially the rancher's wish list. It would extend the ranching leases and lock in ranching as the primary use of the park. So gone were the alternatives to end or reduce ranching. It would allow diversification, that's new agricultural uses, fence out or evict free roaming elk, and shoot or sterilize problem elk, and do very little to address ranching damage to the environment. So this was business as usual with the Park Service trying to benefit these private ranchers who at this point were firmly guiding the ship. Very quietly during 2015 to 2016, the Park Service started shooting tule elk in the park. And this is supposedly to test for Jonas disease, which is a wasting disease. But most of the elk they shot were bulls that they considered problem animals because they were basically acting like elk. And they did no testing at all of the Point Reyes cattle, which are a known source of Jonas disease and the known vector that spread it to the elk in the first place. So after submitting extensive comments and trying to get the Park Service to change direction, the conservation group sued in 2016 to try to stop this public lands giveaway. And we got a settlement in 2017 that required that they update the general management plan with an amendment specifically addressing cattle grazing and elk management and an environmental impact statement within 4 years. And that required an evaluation of no ranching and reduced ranching alternatives. In the middle of this process, Congressman Huffman in 2018 partnered with some Republican anti-public land zealots to introduce legislation to enshrine the private cattle ranching and evict the native tule elk. And luckily, we were able to stop that ridiculous legislation. So in September of 2020, the Park Service finished the plan. They selected alternative B, which you heard what that involves. It basically authorizes continued overgrazing, does little to address the ongoing damage by cattle. It allows the Park Service to shoot elk to keep the Drake's Beach herd at what is a completely arbitrary population cap. And they can haze, remove, or then shoot any free-roaming elk that attempt to create new herds in the park, even if they're not on ranch lands. It also allows other animals like Lizzy mentioned, including sheep, goats, pigs, chickens, and that's going to lead to conflicts with obviously coyotes, bobcats, foxes, some of the crops they're going to plant with birds. And the Park Service has shown a willingness to slaughter tule elk, which are the park's most iconic wildlife for private rancher benefit. What will prevent them from trying to do the same for other wildlife once there are these new conflicts? Hopefully that's going to be you and I preventing that. So we challenged the plan in court earlier this year, and that's where we are now. I'm going to talk a little bit about the status of the 3 elk herds and the Tamales Point situation. This map, the Tamales Point here, you can see where the dark green is the elk reserve behind the fence. The hash lines are the elk range. So this is the Limantour herd down here, south of Drake's Estero, and the Drake's Beach herd out near Drake's Beach. The Limantour and Drake's herds have been slowly expanding, and by 2020, you see the numbers there for Limantour and Drake's Beach, almost 150 elk in both of those. The Tamales Point herd, though, has gone through a number of population crashes. So this is an imprisoned herd that fluctuates from about 280 to 550 elk, and the latest count was 293 at the end of 2020. Now it experiences massive die-offs during drought conditions. So in the fall of 2012, there were 540 elk in that reserve. By 2014, it dropped 47% to 286 elk. So while nearly half the elk inside that fenced area died, the free-roaming herds in the park with access to water increased by nearly a third during the same period. So same situation again, 2019 to 2021, when the herd declined from 445 to 293 elk. And the free-roaming herds either barely declined or stayed stable during that same period of extreme drought because they were able to roam. And thanks to protests and bad publicity, the Park Service relented in 2021 and installed some supplemental water systems and a mineral lick in the elk reserve. But they refused to consider removing the fence during the management plan amendment. They did recently announce that they're going to initiate a planning process for Tamales Point and revise the elk management plan. So this is an opportunity for change, but the Park Service does not want to tear down that fence, nor do the ranchers, and people need to be aware this process may have some bad outcomes for elk. And then I'm going to finish by talking a little bit, next slide, about state management of elk. So less than a decade ago, we had the California Department of Fish and Game, which changed its name to Department of Fish and Wildlife. So that gives you some indication of where our state wildlife agency was. Just recently, they, decided they weren't just for hunting and fishing, but Tule elk are still managed as a game species in the state. The focus really is on hunting. This is an agency that thinks the highest purpose of an elk is to garner game tag money. So, and the CDFW unofficial policy is that there will be no new Tule elk herds introduced in the state. They haven't done a reintroduction since 1998. And one of the reasons is the Jonas disease, which is spread by cattle. So the state was advising the Park Service pretty continuously during the Point Reyes planning process. The ranchers in the Park Service wanted to remove the elk, and CDFW said no, partly because of the Jonas. But they repeatedly advocated for commercial hunting of elk in the national park. And fortunately, that was a little too much for the Park Service, which knew how unpopular that would be and the problems that it would cause. So the state's elk management plan was originally written in 1979 when most of the Tule elk reintroductions were starting. They subsequently did kind of little management plans for high priority elk herds, but this was mostly to expand hunting or deal with problem elk. And finally, in 2018, they updated their management plan. And I got to say, it's a little bit of a travesty. The focus is really on hunting. The state deliberately shut conservation groups out of the planning. They literally ignored all of our comments on the draft plan, did not respond to any of the issues we raised. And the plan was developed with hunters and ranchers and ag interests. The state admitted they don't have basic information about herd sizes and population trends for many herds. No idea what minimum population is needed for herds to be viable, but went ahead and expanded hunting anyway, even on some small and declining herds. So basically, we have a state plan that was written by hunters that's short on science and even tried to scapegoat wolves and set the stage for shooting wolves in California, blame them for elk reductions. I don't want to, to be sure, Tule elk reintroduction overall has been a success story statewide. We now have 5,700 Tule elk in 24 herds around the state, but it is a very slow expansion and recovery. And there really was a missed opportunity at Point Reyes to build up some very large genetically diverse elk herds. This is a park where, supposedly protected federal land with lots of habitat. The carrying capacity we could have herds of thousands of elk. It could be used to improve the genetic viability of the species, since every single Tule elk is descended from one small herd and there's a genetic bottleneck. It could be used to reintroduce elk to new locations and expand existing herds. Really was a blown opportunity because of the state attitude towards elk. So I'll leave it there and be happy to answer any questions at the end.
Thanks so much, Jeff. I think that was a great ending to explain why so many people care about Tule elk and why you guys are fighting so hard to try to achieve some of those ends that you just mentioned. So thanks for that. Next, we're going to turn it over to Laura Cunningham. Laura is the California Director of Western Watersheds Project. She also grew up in the Bay Area and has been visiting Point Reyes for a long time. She is also a very accomplished biologist and writer, naturalist. And so Laura today is going to be sharing some very beautiful photos of parts of the park that are not hammered by cattle and talking to us about some of those unfortunate areas that are. So Laura, you're up.
Yeah, thank you, Lizzie. This is a photo I actually took of a coastal prairie, and that's what I'd like to talk about mostly tonight, is what Point Reyes National Seashore and Golden Gate National Recreation Area probably looked like for thousands of years, with native Tule elk grazing and cultural fire management by the Coast Miwok, which I must honor that how their management over thousands of years has produced such a beautiful area. So we want to acknowledge tribal management here. But this is a photograph of Idaho fescue, blue wild rye, California oatgrass, and a shifting mosaic of coyote brush, which is a native shrub. So this is an area completely ungrazed by beef or dairy cows, in a kind of a remote section of one of the ranch leases where the cows just don't access. So I like to take people out to these relict coastal prairies, which are almost 99% gone from California. So I take a lot of native plant societies, Sierra Club chapters, artist groups, local residents, and show them the wildflowers of the area in the spring. And I think this helps get people to realize what could be in the seashore, not just what you can see in the 10 million acres or so of private ranches and dairies in Marin and Sonoma County. I mean, we're talking about 28,000 acres of ranch leases in a national seashore that could be restored to this. So I have photos of myself taking people out to show these coastal prairie relics. There's a huge diversity of wildflowers here that you can see in April if there's not a drought. And I think this, comparing this coastal prairie relict and others to the grazed livestock ranch leases, has awakened a lot of people to say, wait a minute, you know, maybe we came to Point Reyes National Seashore to see this, native plant communities, tule elk, wildflowers, wildlife. We didn't come here to see barbed wire fences, difficulty accessing trails because there's herds of cows. So I think this has been growing over the years in a rather organic manner where a lot of local residents are sort of waking up to what Point Reyes should be. So coastal prairies are really special. You walk on them, they're spongy, they absorb rainwater, they hold groundwater. And sometimes I ask people to actually get on their hands and knees and look more closely at something called biological soil crusts, which are, you can't see them except very, very closely. You have to look very closely. So this is a large native Pacific reed grass, and it's a summer fog drip area, and you can just see these cushiony, mossy areas just covering the ground, and they're little cup-like lichens, very small, smaller than the tip of your finger. There are other lichens that are branched, and I look at this and it's like a miniature rainforest on a very micro level. But this biological soil crust actually sequesters a large amount of carbon. And I made a sketch after a couple of years of looking at this and learning more about it. And interestingly, most of the activity occurs under the soil. So these big perennial native bunch grasses have very deep roots. They sometimes go down 6 feet into the soil, and the mushrooms, the lichens, the moss, the blue-green algae form a network that actually goes down into the soil too and interconnects with the rootlets of the bunch grasses and the wildflower roots and the coyote brush roots. So this forms quite a store of carbon, but it's also very biologically active, and it's like a sponge absorbing rainwater. This is what Point Reyes should be. So when you look at all the pastures with cows, you notice something very different. They go after those bunch grasses like ice cream. They're usually greener into the summer, so they're the first to get eaten by the cows. And you get a lot of bare ground, disturbed ground with cow tracks, trampled compressed ground, which literally kills off this delicate biological soil crust. Then you get invasive European annual grasses, which are now rampant in the ranch leases. And these have very small roots, as you can see in the bottom of this drawing. A lot of bare ground, a lot of manure, and the soil is now basically dead. It stores very little carbon, and pouring manure on top of the soil doesn't help, because often in rainstorms, that will wash off into streams and the ocean, causing a lot of water pollution, which Chance will talk about. So this illustration just shows the progression of what was once widespread coastal prairie, a diverse ecosystem, and now into this dead soil with bare ground and erosion and weeds. So that's what we're facing in a lot of the ranch leases at the seashore. So I've taken a lot of pictures of the after. The before are these relics of coastal prairie, and the after is basically dead ecosystems that have been removed, trampled. Cows in the seashore are allowed into a lot of ponds and some streams. They create trails which erode in rainstorms. Manure is a rampant problem, especially in the dairies. So 5,700 cows are permitted on this small 28 or so thousand acres of ranch leases on public park land. And that's just way too many. There are too many cows concentrated in a very small area. You can see how Tule elk, I took some pictures of Tule elk on one side and these large dairy cow milkers on the other side of the slide. And Tule elk weigh literally about half as much as a mature dairy cow. They're just a lot less impact on the land. They have smaller hooves. They have smaller muzzles. They produce just literally less urine and poop. So it's just a huge difference between the native Tule elk as a grazer and this heavy Eurasian non-native cow, which is just trampled away the coastal prairie and those delicate biological soil crusts. So we've all gone out there now. There's a lot of citizen scientists and residents who have kind of become awakened to all of this. And when you start to see the difference between a meadow or a coastal prairie that is lightly grazed by Tule elk, and then these pastures filled with cows, the ground trampled and bare, erosion happening, trailing. I mean, a lot of people are beginning to wake up to how degraded this National Park Service land actually is. So one of the more severe problems I've encountered at the seashore is just the amount of cattle is too much for the land, and they create trails. They graze away the deep-rooted bunch grasses, and it's a big impact on streams and salmon and steelhead trout habitat. For instance, I have a picture of home ranch, which is not dairy, but beef cows. And the beef cows still graze this down quite a lot, so that there's actually head cuts forming in the hill slopes. This causes erosion and then sedimentation of salmon streams. And there's a picture I took actually of Olema Creek that shows banks just collapsing. This area was trampled through by beef cows for years and years. And the Park Service is finally trying to fence off this portion of the creek, which is actually critical habitat for federally listed steelhead trout and coho salmon. There are like very weak mitigation measures and management practices that they're trying to stop this bank collapse. But this is just actually atrocious, seeing this type of erosion and sedimentation of salmon spawning habitat. I mean, I've never actually seen anything this bad in other public lands. So this is the National Park Service, and it's supposed to have the highest level of management for conservation. So, I mean, I'll wrap this up quickly by just saying that the cattle have a huge impact, not just on how Tule elk are managed, but how native plant communities are managed, exclusion for years of cultural tribal management. There's a lot of other biodiversity in the park. It's a hot spot for biodiversity, seals, whales on the coast. But the cows have a direct negative impact on coho salmon and steelhead trout. So I'll end it up there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Laura. I think these pictures of what the coastal prairie could look like if it were restored, and these beautiful pictures of salmon and steelhead, and what the streams could look like if the ranchers if the ranching impacts weren't there. Definitely very inspiring. So thanks for all your great work and taking people out there to see what could be. So finally, we have Chance Cutrano. Chance, Chance is the Director of Programs at Resource Renewal Institute. He's also a part-time policymaker in his local community in California. And so Chance today is going to be talking about some of the real conflicts and problems that have arisen over the years and kind of led to some of these problems that Jeff and Laura and I have alluded to. And he's going to wrap us up with some of that, more of that vision for the future of what Point Reyes could be. So Chance, turning it over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lizzie. As she mentioned, my name is Chance Catrano, he, him, his pronouns, coming to you from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Coast Miwok here in Fairfax, just a little ways away from Point Reyes National Seashore. And, I decided that I was going to tackle a couple of the chronic lease violation issues when people talk about the bucolic scenery at Point Reyes National Seashore. I want to give folks a little insight into what I've unfortunately uncovered through my own eyes visiting the seashore since I moved out here to work out here on this and other issues. This landscape was actually acquired in part by the founder of the Resource Renewal Institute, Huey Johnson, who also founded the Trust for Public Land, was the 8th employee of the Nature Conservancy, and also the Secretary of Resources for the state of California under Jerry Brown. And so we've had a long history with the National Seashore since its establishment and all the way through to the litigation with our partners here. When I first came out here, we were experiencing one of a series of awful droughts. We're still in the middle of a drought. It might be just a part of a larger drought experience here in California. But when I first moved out here, this was what the scene looked like at iRanch. I don't even think there's a single native plant on iRanch. I don't see any of the photos or the plants from the photos that Laura was sharing earlier, unfortunately. But this map on the right-hand side is from the park's recent planning, and you see all that sort of magenta color right there. In 2015, that was the land that was overgrazed in Point Reyes National Seashore. Over a third of the national park was overgrazed in 2015. And so much of the park looked like this, especially the dairy ranches. And I chose this photo in particular because just this year it was announced that this rancher, his wells had run dry. His aquifers were not recharging, and he didn't have enough water to allow his cows to drink. And so he had to shut down his operation. And so Huey had always said, nature bats last. When we talk about these issues, the politicians can try to delay the inevitable, but overgrazing is going to be, has been, and will continue to be a chronic issue at the National Seashore. And I have one more photo on this slide, if you can click that, Lizzie. This is just another example. This is over at El Ranch, another dairy on the northern end of that seashore. You can see in that map that the northern end of the park was really hit with overgrazing. There are a whole chunk of dairy ranches on that northern end of the park, some that supply clover, which is a milk brand you might see, organic milk brand you might see in your store. So that milk might be coming from the cows that were at some point maybe grazing something in that field of dirt. So that's the first issue that we were noticing, this chronic overgrazing. So as the Tule elk die-offs out here, tip of the iceberg. This was the next really visible chronic issue, and it's typical to see this in the summer. And if you can click on the next slide, the other massive issue, aside from overgrazing, that we were able to learn about through government documents, their own documentation of it, but also through the great advocacy and grassroots efforts of our local community members here in Marin and in the Bay Area, is the issue of water pollution. I think some of you might be familiar with Jeff's firm, the Center for Biological Diversity, and their publication, Crappiest Places in America, which they put out a few years back. And unfortunately, Point Reyes National Seashore made the list for crappiest places in America. And it's one of the most polluted waterways in California. unfortunately. It's not uncommon if you go out to Point Reyes during first rain events or throughout the rainy season, frankly, to see signs up at the various beaches saying, please, please don't swim. This water is contaminated. This can be seen at various beaches in Point Reyes National Seashore, and that's not to mention the non-recreational water bodies that have tested in recent years, in the last year, for over 40 times the legal standard of water pollution, or what is allowable under law. And we see that both in the dry spreading of manure near these water bodies in places like I Ranch, but also the Lunny Ranch, G Ranch near the Abbott's Lagoon, which is one of the critical water features out there, as well as the Estero, which, as Jeff had mentioned, is technically supposed to be managed as wilderness, as marine wilderness, and yet there's still there's a lack of testing, and there's water pollution for your kayaking trip that comes from dry manure as well as liquefied manure spreading across these ecosystems. You see on that slide on the right is, or on the picture on the right, I'm sorry, is another National Park Service map, and that shows all of the wetland ecosystems in the park. And those are in the white areas, those are all the wetlands that are in spaces that are leased for cattle operations, both in Point Reyes and in the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. So these are ongoing issues. The park is attempting to figure out an approach now that they've been called out again to state agencies and other groups. They're finally saying, okay, maybe we should do something about the manure that's going into all of these waterways in the ocean and in Tamales Bay, which, as Laura was alluding to, along with sedimentation, siltation impacts from erosion from the cattle, it's just another impact on endangered species habitat for salmonids like the coho. Next slide, please. And the final thing I wanted to touch on is just the blatant disregard for the majesty of Point Reyes National Seashore that we've seen in recent years, but for the last couple decades, there's been a lack of enforcement, and what that has resulted in is a certain degree of disregard on behalf of the folks who are leasing these federal lands, our public lands. You see this photo on the left. It actually was discovered August 12th of last year. A birder had heard some strange noises near Drake's Estero and was walking Estero Trail and decided to check this out. And it turns out one of the ranchers, the rancher at Home Ranch, decided to bulldoze about 165 feet to create a new road and cut some trees down so that their cattle could have access to the nearby stream. While they were caught doing this, it was because their bulldozer was stuck in the stream bank as they drove over the stream bank and destroyed it. Since then, there's been remediation, but it's because of our efforts out there that we're actually capturing some of the activities that probably go on out there all the time. That click right there, you see that little green circle, is actually where this had occurred. And that is actually a steelhead critical habitat stream. And so we did alert the Coastal Commission, which is a statewide agency that protects coastal resources. And we've been in discussions with the Park Service about remediation, but there's nothing quite like just stopping it or preventing it from happening in the first place, because there's no way. There are tons of invasives that have already come into this new habitat. I've been there since, and there are no ways to mitigate the trees that have been cut down to create those spaces for cattle to get into the streams. Next step, please, or slide. And so, back to Jeff's point about the initial point, the Organic Act, preserving these resources and these public lands unimpaired. Every time we hear about a new thing happening out at Point Reyes and we have these opportunities for planning, I want you to consider images like these in front of you and whether or not these equate to leaving resources unimpaired for future generations, whether it's the overgrazing impacts, whether it's the water quality and the water quantity issues during the drought that have affected wildlife like the Tule elk, or whether it's the disregard and for the park and its resources and the fact that it's public land, that's a privilege that these folks have who are ranching out there. And this is just a dump site that was captured recently, again last fall out there. And so I'll head to the next slide. And this is something that our coalition had proposed to the Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, last July. We've heard about what's going on out there. We've heard about Alternative B and the fact that it's just another sort of sellout of our public lands at Point Reyes for a select few privileged individuals who, basically took this land from an entire other community without thinking about the impacts and completely erasing that culture and establishing this culture that cannot be questioned. And when I look at the opportunities that the Park Service thought about, even cursory discussions that occurred in their planning process for alternative F for the future, F for moving forward for Point Reyes, it really seemed like a turning point for Point Reyes. The fact that you'd be able to deal with raven predation issues, because the population of ravens is the highest at Point Reyes anywhere in the San Francisco Bay Area, because there's so many cattle operations that are dense and concentrated in that area, and they impact endangered species like the snowy plover. But removing or eliminating the ranches would mean that there's new habitat for endangered species, and there's less predation, less pressure on those species. It would mean that, like when I was a boy going up to Prairie Creek with my parents in Northern California near Redwood National Park and camping on the beach, I would wake up and I saw Roosevelt elk. And you could have that same experience here. Even today, the elk behind the fence, you can kayak in and camp in the wilderness area, and you can hear the elk bugling in the middle of the night. It is the most fantastic, haunting, beautiful experience. But to have those things, to have new campgrounds, new trail access, to have new interpretive experiences, both for historic ranching, but also for the Coast Miwok and all the other communities that have called Point Reyes home. There's so many adaptive reuse possibilities out there that are not possible when 340 miles of barbed wire fences exist that keep the public out or dissuade the public from accessing their public lands. And so we're continuing to pressure the Park Service with your support as we build this coalition to realize some of these visions and some of these possibilities and try to eliminate some of those paradoxes that have plagued, that's a lot of P's, but paradoxes that have plagued the seashore since it was established in 1962. So thank you very much.
Awesome, Chance. Well, that was a great way to sum up. And I think, thinking about those opportunities for public use and enjoyment here are particularly important given the proximity of Point Reyes National Seashore to such a massive population center. As somebody who grew up in an urban area kind of far from public lands, just this unique and magical opportunity to access these places, that are so close to people. It's just pretty incredible. And there are parts of Point Reyes that are open to the public, but gosh, it's a crowded place, and having all of these tens of thousands of acres that are devoted to manure dairy production, yes, it would be fantastic to see that vision. So without further ado, we want to start answering some of your questions. We've gotten a whole bunch in various ways over the course of the program. So I'm going to kick it off with, I think, one of the most important ones, and I'm paraphrasing here, essentially, you guys have made such a convincing case for why this place matters and that people should, be working to protect it. But what can people do now that the plan has been chosen and the lawsuit has been launched? How else can folks that are, members of the public put pressure on elected officials or agencies to try to change course. I've got one answer quickly, and that is this spring. Chance mentioned the California Coastal Commission. Well, this spring, the Park Service has to go back to the California Coastal Commission to get permission to basically sign these leases. There was an unprecedented public outcry last year when the Park Service went to the Coastal Commission for the first time. And you know, it just absolutely amazed me. What was it, 40,000 public comments or something? People submitted 45,000 public comments to the Coastal Commission on this issue. And so as a result of all that pressure, the Coastal Commission put some stringent conditions on the Park Service's new plan that they have to come back and prove that, you know, the water quality management monitoring mitigation plan is going to be up to snuff. And so there should be public comment opportunities associated with that. And so I would encourage you to, I think Resource Renewal Institute and all of your groups, I don't know, if you're not following their, getting their e-blasts and stuff, you definitely should, because they do a good job of alerting you to those opportunities. So that public comment opportunity is coming up. Any other thoughts, Chance, Jeff, or Laura, on ways to help put pressure on the people who matter? Laura?
Yeah, I mean, I can say there's always the opportunity that you can write your Congress people, Mr. Huffman, Senator Padilla. I mean, there's any time you want, you can say, you know, here's a letter. I want to support wildlife and restoration on the seashore. I would rather not have ranching if that's your opinion. You can always write your Congress people. And you can also go hiking in your seashore and your public lands and observe things. And you can write the superintendent of Point Reyes National Seashore and give him your opinions or report anything that you see. I think that the citizen engagement is crucial to letting the decision makers know what we think. So, you know, you can always do that.
Absolutely. So you mentioned this. Yes, there are quite a few questions about some of the political engagement from Representative Huffman and Feinstein. I think Jeff Miller answered a couple of those questions during his presentation, but yes, there has been quite a bit of political interest in helping the ranchers from the Democratic side down in California. And so I think that's why one of the reasons why Laura's point about, you know, contacting folks that matter both in California, those politicians, but also, you know, other congressmen and women who are on the natural resource committees, you know, hearing about this level of interest in protecting this place, this special place is always a good idea. So as for questions about what is motivating those Senator Feinstein and Representative Huffman to support the ranchers, I don't feel like we are necessarily the best folks to answer that. So we will keep moving. So this is a great question from someone about whether the visitors can hike on the leased land. Who wants to field that one?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I mean, it's a quick yes. It's your public land. You can hike on it. You can, you know, explore it. With one caveat. The caveat is that the leased ranch core area is sort of where all the milking is done at the dairies and where all their equipment is, where people are living, whether it's the families or the ranch hands or the ranch managers. That area is off limits to members of the public, and the National Park Service on their website has a map that basically shows where those areas generally are with some pretty clear boundaries so that people aren't invading the privacy of folks. But again, it's one of the outcomes of the ongoing leasing of these lands is that there are sections of the seashore that are sort of beachfront real estate on, that's cheaper than my apartment out here.
And I will just say, kind of skimming through some of the chat, I will say that I do think that public outcry really has made a difference in this situation. As Jeff Miller mentioned, this coalition and a whole bunch of others helped defeat some very nasty legislation that was proposed during the last administration. And so, that was super important. And this plan that we have challenged is obviously full of tons of flaws from the Trump administration, but public outcry did lead the Biden administration to make some last minute changes to the plan in response to that. And so, I've just been truly amazed at the outcry in this situation and the massive change of public opinion, thanks to some impressive community organizing that was done by these folks and many of their partners and allies. I think there were some comments in the chat as well, and some questions about there is another pending lawsuit over Point Reyes National Seashore, specifically about the Tamales Point issue. And so, yes, there have been a lot of people who have been involved. Chance, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, piggyback on the public outcry bit, and I think Jeff or Laura could definitely speak to this as well. But when we first started this and worked on the first lawsuit in 2016, there was so little coverage and so few people wanted to talk about this. And to come to where we are today, where the LA Times and National Geographic and The Hill are writing about this in big ways, and where we now have on our side the data that shows that over 91% of the people that commented on the plan that the park produced were in favor of restoring the seashore, or were opposed to ranching on various grounds, whether it was elk or just being outright opposed to ranching. But we now have that data. We have the Coastal Commission data that's even stronger. And that's because everybody's adding their voice to the discussion. And now these agencies can't just push us aside and say that, we know what the public wants. No, the public's weighing in, and it's like overwhelmingly in favor of a new path forward for the seashore. So I just wanted to plus one that. I think we've come a long way, and really encourage people to continue to add their voice, because it does matter.
Jeff, you got a last comment?
Oh, I'll second that. I think we have really changed the narrative. This started 10 years ago as a very provincial kind of entitled issue, and you couldn't touch the sacred cows of organic local cheese and grass-fed beef. And now people understand that this is we've nationalized the issue. This is a national park. It belongs to the public, not to these 18 ranching families. And I'll also just add, the ranchers and ag interests are pretty tireless in their lobbying. They are well organized, and they've got the ear of some politicians. And we've managed to turn that narrative around by making them hear the public loud and clear. So I'd say keep it up, amplify it, and let's win this battle and take back our park.
Yes, well said, Jeff. Well said. So on that note, I think Jeff and some others put some links in the chat for you all to their organizations. Our website is listed on this slide. Feel free to reach out, sign up, hear about what's going on. But yes, I am very grateful for our environmental laws that facilitated this public process and the community organizing that has allowed it to be so successful. And so thank you so much for all of your efforts here. I think with that, I am going to turn it back over to Will. Will, there you are.
Great. Thank you so much, Lizzy. Thanks for facilitating tonight's conversation. Thank you to Jeff, Laura, and Chance for such passionate and informative presentations. We are so pleased to be able to, at Advocates for the West, to be able to partner with groups like RRI and WWP and CBD And it's something that's doing the work that we're doing is extremely important and can only be made possible by supporters like you who are with us tonight. So thank you so much for that. If you do feel inspired this evening, we hope that you will give a gift to us to help us continue this important work. You can make a donation and learn more about the work that we're doing, as Lizzy mentioned, at advocateswest.org. We will be sending out a follow-up email to attendees, thanking you for joining us and including a link to the recording from tonight's webinar that will be on our YouTube channel. Please feel free to share it far and wide with folks who you think might be interested in our work. And as a reminder, we will have another Voices for the West on March 30th, focused on the Grand Salmon Source to Sea project and related efforts to save salmon and restore healthy river ecosystems in the Pacific Northwest. So stay tuned for more info on that. And with that, I hope everyone has a wonderful evening. Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thanks for joining us. Great job, Jeff, Chance, and Laura. It's so wonderful to work with you all.